guys, you're going to be so happy to know that this is the last two lessons of radical expressions. So we've simplified, then added and subtracted. We did a little bit of multiplying. We're going to continue multiplying with the distributive property. And then we're lastly going to divide. And then that's it as far as radical expressions go. Then we'll start doing some review, just kind of wrapping up the rest of the year. So let's take a look here. So you're going to multiply by that coefficient up front. Still, multiplication rules still hold. So you're going to multiply the coefficients and then multiply within the radicals. However, if it's a coefficient plus a radical, remember you can't add those together. It has to be the same radicand in order to add them together. So that's what we're going to look at. So our first example, we have the square root of 6 times 3 plus the square root of 8. So here's what we're going to do first. We're going to distribute this square root of 6 to both of those. So this is going to be 3 square root of 6 plus the square root of 48. So 48 comes from 6 times 8. So that is what goes there. So now I am going to try to think of a perfect square that can go into 6. I got nothing. But there is a perfect square that can go into 48, and that's 16. So 4 does go into 48, but 16 does too, and it's bigger. So it leads us to not have to do as much reducing. And simplifying, and what I've seen is that's kind of where you guys are struggling at. So I have 3 square root of 6 plus, this can be written as a square root of 16 times a square root of 3. Okay, so the way I can figure that out is I can do 48 divided by 16, and that's that other number, the 3. So then this becomes 3 square root of 6 plus the square root of 16 is 4. So remember, that's why we did that, square root of 3. And that's where you stop because our radicands are not the same here. So we stop here, and that's a simplified form. All right, so let's look at the next one. So I'm going to multiply the square root of 15 times both of those. So I have 2 square root of 15 plus the square root of 75. So multiplying 15 times 5. So now I'm trying to think of a perfect square that can go into 15. Nope, can't find anything there. But I can find a perfect square that goes into 75. So this is going to say 2 square root of 15 plus the square root of 25 times the square root of 3. And then I would have 2 square root of 15 plus 5 square root of 3. And that's where I'm going to stop because they don't have the same radicand. Then let's look at example 3 here. So this one looks a little bit different because I have a coefficient and a radicand, so I'm going to have to multiply there. So I'm going to multiply both of these times here and here. So I'm going to have 3 times 5, that makes 15 square root of 10. So that stays there. Then I'm going to do plus, I'm going to do 3 times 4, which is going to give me 12. And then 10 times 2, which is going to be the square root of 20. So now I'm going to think of a perfect square that can go into 10, nothing, but there is a perfect square that can go into 20. So this just stays 15 square root of 10 plus 12, and then this is going to be the square root of 4 and times the square root of 5. So I have 15 square root of 10 plus 12 times 2, because that's the square root of 4, times the square root of 5. And so then I would have 15 square root of 10 plus 24 square root of 5. And then that's where I would stop because they don't have the same radicands now. So you'll have, on your skill check, up to 4 possible blanks. All right, so moving on. So now we're going to kind of throw in some of those negatives and minuses. So you're going to make sure that you're paying close attention to that. So the rules still stay the same. So I'm going to distribute here and here. So that's a negative 2 times 3. That's going to give me a negative 6 square root of 30. And then I'm going to minus, it's negative 2 times negative 3. That's actually going to be a plus 6 times the square root of 18. So perfect square that can go into 30. Can't think of one. So it stays. That's a pretty large square root. So negative 6 square root of 30, but there is a perfect square that goes into 18, and that's 9. So I would have plus 6 times the square root of 9 times the square root of 2. So it's negative 6 square root of 30 plus 6 times 3, because that's the square root of 9. That's why we did that, the square root of 2. And then negative 6 square root of 30 plus 18 square root of 2. And then we leave those there because there's not a perfect square that can go into 30 that's going to give you the same coefficients or same radicand that you can add them. All right, so again, distributing negative 4 square root of 2 to both of those there. So I'm going to multiply negative 4. Now remember, this coefficient out front is a 1, so it's negative 4 times 1, so it's going to be a negative 4. And then I multiply underneath the radicand, so that'd be 12. Plus, and then I have a negative 4 times 3. That actually makes a negative 12 square root of 28. This time I have perfect squares that can go into both of those. And it looks like 4 is both of those. So I have negative 4, and then I have the square root of 4 times the square root of 3 minus 12, and this is the square root of 4 times the square root of 7. Now, a lot of you have asked if you have to put the perfect square first. You don't. However, after you find the square root, it's going to come out of the radical sign, and so that's easier to simplify, in my opinion. So that's why I always write that first and on the left. So you don't have to, but that's how I do it. So I have negative 4 times 2, because that's the square root of 4, times the square root of 3, minus, almost wrote plus, minus 12 times 2 square root of 7. So then I'm going to multiply these two. That makes negative 8 square root of 3. And I multiply this. That's going to be minus 24 square root of 7. So that right there is what we have left over. So we can't get those together because they don't have the same radicand. Okay, last example here. I'm going to distribute the 5 square root of 3 to both of those expressions. So I'm going to have 5, because remember that coefficient is a 1 there, times the square root of 54, and then minus 10, because that's 5 times negative 2. That's going to give you a negative 10, and the square root of 30. So I'm going to have a perfect square in 54, which is the square root of 9 times the square root of 6. That 5 still stays down. And then there's not a perfect square that can go into 30. So that just stays a square root of 30. And then I would have 5 times 3, because that's what the square root of 9 is, times the square root of 6, minus 10 square root of 30. Multiply those two together, I get 15 square root of 6 minus 10 square root of 30. I'll leave that there. Okay. What I'm seeing as far as questions from you guys is probably the most often is just the simplifying part. So you want to keep those perfect squares that list somewhere close by. Write it on a sticky note, on an index card, something that, or on a sheet of paper that you're going to have close by to you when you're doing your work, because that's, to me, has been what I think most of you had questions with. Also, something I just want to make sure you understand is that when you find the square root of 16, that does not become the square root of 4. That's not right. It just becomes a 4 out front. Okay, so if I had a 2 out here, this is like 2 times 4. So if I had 2 times the square root of 16, that becomes just 8. Okay, so a lot of you, I still see you, once you have found the perfect square, you keep it underneath that radical sign, and then you're like, I'm really confused on where it went wrong here. So that's a key thing there. Just kind of a heads up, remember on your skill check, so for your skill check, make sure that you're going to have 4 blanks, okay? So you'll have like blank, and then a square root sign blank, and then it will have blank, square root sign, looks more like this, and then another blank. Make sure you keep signs there, especially with this one right here, okay? So like if I were to write number 4 in my skill check, there's going to be 4 blanks, so this is like number 1, This is number 2, this is number 3 blank, and this is number 4 blank. So 1, 2, 3, 4 blanks. Okay, so in the first blank, if I'm writing skill check problem number 4 right here, the first blank is going to be -6. The second blank is going to be 30. The third blank is going to be +6. And then the fourth blank is going to be a 2. Okay, so for the coefficients, you need to make sure you write the signs, but not for the radicands, because they will always be positive. So you don't have to worry about that. But for the coefficients, you do want to make sure you write those signs. So this is it, multiplying radical expressions. We've got one more lesson, and then that's it for radical expressions.